My stepdad tried to make me pay rent in my house. So I told him, if that's the rule, he has to pay too. I've always known this house was mine, not in the way kids claim their bedrooms or their favorite spots on the couch, but really mine. My name is on the deed, signed and sealed long before I was old enough to understand what it meant. My dad, David, made sure of that before he died. But here's the thing, no one talks about it. Not my mom, not my stepdad, Greg, and definitely not me. For the past 11 years, I've lived in this house like any other kid would, except I wasn't just some kid living under my parents' roof. I was the owner. The walls, the floors, the backyard, the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, all of it legally belongs to me. But you wouldn't know that by the way Greg walks around here, acting like the man of the house, making rules, giving orders. The truth is, he has no idea who this house really belongs to. He thinks it's my mom's. It's almost funny how wrong he is. My dad, David, wasn't around much when I was little. Not because he didn't want to be, but because life had other plans. He and my mom, Linda, weren't married and their relationship wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Still, he made one thing clear. He wasn't going to leave me with nothing. Before he died, suddenly, in an accident, he did the one thing no one expected. He left the house to me, not to my mom, not to a distant relative. To me? I was only 6 at the time. Too young to understand what a will was, too young to know what it meant to own property. But the legal system didn't care about my age. The house was mine, on paper and in reality. My mom became my guardian, and naturally we kept living here. But there was one problem. She never told Greg. Greg came into the picture a few years later. He and my mom met, hit it off, and before I knew it, he was in our lives for good. When they got married, he moved in, unpacked his bags, and made himself comfortable. And why wouldn't he? As far as he knew, this house was my mom's. He must have thought she inherited it after my dad passed. Not once did she correct him. Not once did she tell him that legally, he was living in a house that didn't belong to her. Maybe she didn't think it mattered. Maybe she assumed that eventually I'd go off to college, move out, and Greg could just take over. But I'm not going anywhere. Greg isn't a bad guy, not in the traditional sense. He doesn't hit me, doesn't yell much. He's never tried to be my dad, which, honestly, I appreciate. But there's always been a distance between us, something unspoken that neither of us bothers to bridge. We tolerate each other, that's all. He acts like he's in charge, though. That's the part that gets under my skin. He makes the house rules. He decides what's appropriate. He talks about how we, as in the family, should handle home maintenance, how we should split responsibilities. Except we don't own this house. I do. But I've never corrected him. I've kept my mouth shut, let him believe what he wants. It wasn't worth the argument. Besides, what did it matter? He wasn't hurting anyone with his delusions. At least that's what I thought. Lately, though, something's changed. Greg's been talking a lot more about responsibility, about how things aren't cheap, and how everyone has to pull their weight. Every other conversation seems to circle back to bills, utilities, groceries, and his favorite topic, what it means to be an adult. "You're almost 18, Alex," he told me the other night, leaning against the kitchen counter with that patronizing smirk he gets when he thinks he's teaching me something valuable. It's time to start thinking about the real world. I just nodded, pretending to listen. But in the back of my mind, something felt off. Greg wasn't just rambling about life lessons anymore. He was working up to something. I could feel it. It was the way he watched me when he spoke, like he was waiting for a reaction. The way he lingered in conversations about financial responsibility, repeating himself, as if he wanted to make sure I was really hearing him. Something was coming. I didn't know what. But I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. And then, a week before my 18th birthday, it finally happened. The moment that would change everything. It was a regular evening. I had just finished dinner and was about to head to my room when Greg's voice cut through the quiet air of the living room. "Alex, we need to talk." His tone wasn't its usual passive-aggressive mutter. It was serious, almost authoritative. I turned to see him standing near the couch, arms crossed, face set like stone. He didn't look angry, but there was something about the way he squared his shoulders that made my stomach tighten. I had a bad feeling about this. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the armchair across from him. I hesitated but sat. My mother, Linda, was at the kitchen sink, wiping down the counter. She didn't turn around or say anything. That was my second clue that whatever was about to happen wasn't good. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, locking eyes with me. "You're turning 18 soon." I nodded, wary. "Yeah, in a week." He nodded back like that confirmed something for him. "And that means it's time for you to start thinking about your future, about responsibility." "Here we go." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. Greg inhaled, like he was about to say something profound. Then, in the calmest, most matter-of-fact voice, he said, "If you want to keep living here after your birthday, you'll need to start paying rent." At first, I thought I misheard him. I blinked. "Wait. What?" "You'll have to contribute," he repeated, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "It's part of growing up, learning how to be independent. We can't keep covering all your expenses forever, Alex. It's only fair." Fair. That word echoed in my head, bouncing around like a joke without a punchline. I stared at him, trying to gauge if this was some twisted test, if he expected me to grovel or show gratitude. But his expression was firm, unwavering. He actually meant it. My fingers curled into fists against my thighs. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. Greg's brow furrowed. "Of course I'm serious. Everyone pays their share. That's how the world works." I leaned back in my chair, running a hand down my face. The absurdity of the moment was suffocating. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "You want me to pay rent? For living in my house?" Greg's jaw clenched slightly. "It's not your house, Alex. It belongs to your mother, and I'm the one managing the finances here. We all have responsibilities." I couldn't hold back my scoff. "Wow, you really believe that, don't you?" He sat up straighter. "Believe what?" "That this place belongs to my mom. That you have any say in how it's run. That you can just—" I shook my head, exhaling sharply. Unbelievable. His patience was wearing thin now. "Look, Alex, I know you're young, but this is just how life works. You don't get to live rent-free forever." Something inside me snapped. "You really have no idea, do you?" I murmured. Greg narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. This man had been living under this roof for years, walking around like he owned the place, setting rules, making decisions, and he had no idea whose name was actually on the deed. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're wrong, Greg," I said, my voice eerily steady. "This house doesn't belong to my mom. It never did." He chuckled, shaking his head. "What kind of nonsense are you—" "It belongs to me." Silence. Greg's expression froze mid-scoff, the confidence in his eyes flickering, like a candle struggling against the wind. He blinked. "What?" I leaned forward now, mirroring his earlier posture, making sure he heard me clearly this time. "This house is mine," I repeated. "My dad left it to me in his will when he died. I've legally owned it since I was 6 years old." Greg didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me like I had just spoken in a foreign language. Then he let out a short, disbelieving laugh. No, that's not possible." I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled through my files, and within seconds, the document was on the screen. I turned the phone toward him. "Read it yourself." His hand twitched, but he didn't take the phone. His gaze flickered over the text, scanning the bold legal language. His lips parted slightly. I watched as the reality sank in, watched the color drain from his face. His entire posture stiffened. The arrogance, the authority he had carried so effortlessly, it all cracked like thin glass. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "Your mother never told you." I finished for him. "Yeah, I figured." Greg turned toward the kitchen, where my mother stood frozen, gripping the edge of the counter. She hadn't intervened once during this conversation. His voice hardened. "Linda, is this true?" She didn't answer right away. The hesitation in her silence was deafening. Finally, she exhaled and turned around slowly. "Greg, she started softly. That was all he needed. His whole body tensed as if she had just confirmed his worst fear. My mom hadn't told him. Not in all these years. Greg turned back to me, his expression unreadable. His face was locked in something between anger, humiliation, and realization. And me? I just sat there, watching him drown in the truth. For the first time since he moved in, Greg finally understood. He wasn't the one in control here. I was. The living room felt like a pressure chamber, the air thick and suffocating. Nobody spoke. Greg sat frozen in place, his eyes locked onto mine, waiting, no, hoping, that I would crack a grin and say this was all just a joke. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring back at him, my expression calm, unwavering. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Greg let out a short, forced chuckle, shaking his head as if he was trying to shake off the entire conversation. All right, kid, that was a good one, he muttered, his lips twisting into something that almost resembled a smirk. But let's not play games with the adults, all right? His voice was steady, but there was something off. A tiny tremor hidden beneath his words. Doubt. He didn't want to believe me, but he couldn't ignore the way my mother had gone completely silent. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers moved with controlled precision as I navigated to my saved documents. The will. Without breaking eye contact, I placed the phone on the coffee table and turned the screen toward him. Read it yourself. Greg hesitated. For a split second, I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. His hand twitched before he finally leaned forward, his gaze dropping to the glowing screen. His eyes flicked over the words, scanning, searching, probably hoping to find some loophole, some mistake, some way out. His lips parted slightly. His breathing slowed, then became uneven. I watched as his face transformed, his usual smug expression melting away like ice under a scorching sun. First, there was confusion, then realization, and finally, shock. His lips moved, forming silent words, but no sound came out. Finally, barely above a whisper, he muttered, No, this can't be right." But it was right. It had always been right. Greg straightened, his entire body tense, his fingers curled into fists against his knees. He reread the document as if, by sheer force of will, he could make the words change. But they didn't. The house had belonged to me since I was 6 years old. Slowly, Greg lifted his head, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "So what?" he finally said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You've been letting me believe all these years that this was your mother's house? That I had a say in anything?" I shrugged. "I didn't let you believe anything. You just assumed. That's on you." Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You little—" He cut himself off, closing his eyes for a moment as if trying to rein in his temper. When he opened them again, the anger was still there, but buried under something more dangerous. Calculation. I knew that look. He was already trying to figure out his next move. Greg wasn't the kind of man who lost gracefully. I could feel it coming. The storm before the real storm. His voice was cold when he spoke again. "So what now? You expect me to just accept this? To bow down and thank you for letting me live in your house?" His lips curled. "That's not how family works, kid. This house has been my home just as much as yours." I tilted my head slightly, watching him. "You mean the house you just tried to charge me rent for?" That shut him up. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "Yeah, I thought so." I could see the conflict warring inside him, his pride clashing with the reality of the situation. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. And worse, he had been completely blindsided. That's when it hit me. Greg hadn't just assumed the house belonged to my mom. My mom had never told him otherwise. Slowly, I turned to look at her. She had barely moved this entire time, still standing near the kitchen counter, hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then I knew. Greg's ignorance wasn't an accident. My mother had let him believe this was her house. I felt something bitter rise in my chest. "Mom," I said, my voice quieter now, colder. He never knew, did he? She flinched. That was all the answer I needed. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. You never told him. Silence. She didn't meet my eyes. Greg snapped his head toward her. Linda, he demanded, tell me this kid is lying. She opened her mouth, closed it. And then she sighed. I didn't think it mattered, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Greg let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Didn't matter? Are you serious? He turned back to me, pointing a finger. So all these years, this little shit has been pretending to be some freeloading teenager, when in reality, he was the damn landlord. I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling beneath my skin. I wasn't pretending to be anything, Greg. I didn't feel the need to rub it in your face. But you let me think. Greg ran a hand through his hair, exhaling harshly. He looked betrayed. And honestly, I didn't care. Greg had never treated me like a son. He had treated me like an obligation, like something he had to put up with because I came with the package when he married my mom. He had never cared about me, not really. And yet, now that he realized he had never actually had control here, he acted like he was the victim. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. You know what's funny? I said. If you had never pulled that pay rent bullshit, you could have lived the rest of your life believing this house was yours. But you had to push it, didn't you? I leaned forward, my voice dropping just slightly. You had to try and show me who's in charge. Greg's nostrils flared. His face was red now, fists clenched at his sides. And for the first time since this conversation started, I saw it. Fear. Not just anger, not just humiliation. Real, genuine fear. Because now, he knew he had no power here. I could kick him out if I wanted to. And by the way he was looking at me now, I think he knew I was seriously considering it. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the first time ever, Greg knew the truth. This was my house, and I wasn't going anywhere. Morning came, but the tension from last night hadn't faded. It had thickened, coiling around the house like an unseen force. The air was heavy with something unspoken, something raw. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee like she always did, but her movements were stiff, mechanical. She was trying to act normal, as if the conversation from last night hadn't happened. As if everything was still the way it was before. It wasn't. Greg was already at the dining table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug, his face blank as he stared at the newspaper in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but I knew him well enough by now. He was thinking, calculating. The way he sat so still, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the side of his mug. It was the quiet before the storm. I sat down across from him, setting my own cup of coffee on the table. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even glance up. My mother, standing by the counter, darted a nervous glance in my direction. I took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough before I finally spoke. I thought a lot about what you said yesterday, I said, my voice calm, measured. Greg's eyes flickered upward, just for a second before he masked it with indifference. He turned a page in the newspaper, pretending like he wasn't interested, but I saw the tension in his jaw. He was waiting. I set my cup down. And I think you had a point. Greg finally looked up, an eyebrow slightly raised. A point? I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Yeah, about responsibility, about contributing. I leaned back in my chair. You said that anyone who lives in this house should pay their fair share, that it's only right, that it's how the world works. Greg straightened slightly, his interest piqued. He glanced at my mother, as if to say, see, the kid's finally getting it. I exhaled slowly and let the words fall like a hammer. Starting next month, you and Mom will also need to pay rent. Greg's entire body went rigid. The moment hung in the air, suspended between us like a live wire. My mother's hand, which had been reaching for her coffee, froze midair. Greg blinked once, then twice, like he hadn't heard me properly. Then, very slowly, he set his newspaper down. The hell did you just say? His voice was low, controlled, but there was an underlying sharpness to it, like a blade just beneath the surface. I met his gaze without flinching. You heard me. My mother's voice was a whisper. Alex. Greg let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, that's cute. That's real cute, kid. You think you're funny? I tilted my head. Was it funny when you told me I had to pay rent? The smirk on his face flickered, but he forced it back. That was different. I raised an eyebrow. How? Greg leaned forward, placing both arms on the table. His voice dropped into something lower, something meant to intimidate. Because I'm your mother's husband. I've been living here, taking care of this house, paying for things you don't even think about. I earned my place here. I stared at him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Okay, so, let's say you have been paying for things. Great. That means you'll have no problem putting it in writing, right? Greg's nostrils flared. What? I pulled my phone out again and placed it on the table. A lease, a rental agreement. We can make it official. Greg slammed his mug down, the ceramic clattering against the wood. Are you out of your damn mind? I am not paying rent in my own home. I let a smirk tug at the corner of my lips. Oh, but you expected me to? My mother finally found her voice. Alex, stop this, she pleaded. You don't need to do this. We're a family. Then why wasn't I treated like family yesterday? I shot back, turning to her. Why was I being treated like a tenant in my own house? She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Because she had no answer. Greg, on the other hand, was furious. His face had gone red and his fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white. This is ridiculous. I'm not doing this. And you sure as hell can't force me. I took a breath, then calmly picked up my phone. Actually, I can. Greg's eyes narrowed. What the hell does that mean? I pulled up the ownership document again, the one with my name on it. Legally, this house belongs to me. And legally, I have the right to charge rent or evict anyone who refuses to pay. The vein in Greg's forehead pulsed. You wouldn't dare. I held his gaze, my expression never wavering. Try me. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked between the two of us, horrified. Alex, please, don't do this. This is going to tear this family apart. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. Mom, it's already torn apart, and it's not because of me. I turned back to Greg. It's because he tried to pull this bullshit power move. It's because he thought he could control something that was never his. Greg shot up from his chair so fast it nearly toppled over. You little piece of shit. I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. I just tilted my head slightly, eyes still locked onto his. What, Greg? What are you gonna do? Yell at me some more? Call me names? Tell me how unfair I'm being. I leaned forward, voice dropping into something ice cold. That's rich. Coming from a man who thought it was perfectly fair when I was the one being asked to pay up. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. He had no comeback, because he knew I was right. And so, the inevitable happened. Greg let out a bitter, guttural noise of frustration and slammed his hands on the table. This is bullshit. I smiled, slow and sharp. That's what I said yesterday. The room fell into silence. Greg stood there, breathing heavily, his whole body vibrating with barely contained fury. My mother looked like she was about to cry. But me? I was calm, because for the first time in my life I had the upper hand. Greg wasn't in control here. I was. Greg didn't storm out. He didn't throw another tantrum. Instead, he did something much worse. He smiled. It wasn't a warm, genuine smile. It was something colder, something calculated, like he had just found a new angle, a different way to play this game. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the table, his posture suddenly relaxed. The fury in his eyes hadn't disappeared, but it had been buried under something else. Something more dangerous. So that's how you want to play it? His voice was low, almost amused. You really want to go down this road, Alex? I crossed my arms. I'm just following your rules, Greg. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like I was some naive little kid who didn't know what I was getting myself into. You think you've won something here? He mused. Kid, you have no idea what you're doing. I said nothing. His smirk widened just slightly. "Tell me something," he continued, tilting his head. "Why do you think your mom never told me about this house being yours?" My jaw clenched. The smirk disappeared. His eyes locked onto mine. "Seriously, think about it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping just slightly. "If she really believed this house was yours, if she truly thought you were the one in charge, why did she let me believe otherwise all these years?" The confidence I had built up suddenly felt like it had a crack running through it. I didn't answer, because for the first time I wasn't sure I had one. Greg saw it. He saw the hesitation, the brief flicker of doubt in my expression, and he latched onto it like a shark sensing blood. He sat up straighter, his tone turning almost casual. "See, that's the thing, Alex. If your mom had actually wanted you to have control over this house, she would have told me, wouldn't she?" His lips curved into something dangerously close to a smirk. "But she didn't. She let me believe it was her house. She let me handle everything. So tell me." His voice was silk now, smooth and sharp at the same time. "Why do you think that is?" I clenched my fists beneath the table. He was playing mind games. I knew that. But the worst part? It was working. I turned to my mother, looking for... what, exactly? Reassurance? A denial? Anything? But she wouldn't even meet my eyes. A strange coldness seeped into my chest. "Mom," I said, my voice quieter now, more uncertain than I wanted it to be. "Is that true?" She swallowed hard, hesitated, then finally looked at me. Her expression was complicated. Torn. "Alex," she said softly, I didn't want to make things harder for you." I frowned. "Harder how?" She glanced at Greg, then back at me, her hands wringing together. "I thought it was easier this way, letting Greg handle things, keeping everything stable." Stable. That word echoed in my head like a slap. "You mean easier for you?" I said, my voice sharper now. She winced. That's exactly what it is." My voice rose slightly. "You let him believe he had control because you didn't want to deal with the truth." Greg chuckled. "Finally catching on, huh?" I ignored him. My eyes were still locked on my mother. "So what now, Mom? Now that the truth is out, are you still going to pretend like this house belongs to both of you?" She exhaled slowly, looking more exhausted than anything. "Alex," she said softly, pleadingly. "We're family." A cold weight settled in my stomach. There it was. That word. Greg saw his opportunity and jumped in immediately. "Exactly," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're family, and you're over here talking about rent and eviction like we're strangers." He scoffed. "Is that really the kind of person you want to be, Alex? The kind of guy who kicks his own mother and stepfather out of their home?" I clenched my jaw. He was twisting it, turning it into something ugly. Making me the villain. And worst of all, my mother wasn't stopping him. She wasn't telling him he was wrong. She wasn't standing up for me. She was letting him do it. I felt something inside me crack. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let's be real here, kid," he said, his voice almost gentle now. "I've been the one keeping this house running. I've paid for the groceries, the maintenance, the bills, with Mom's money," I snapped, "not yours." He ignored me. "And now, after everything I've done, you want to treat me like some random tenant? Like I'm just some guy freeloading off your generosity?" He let out a bitter laugh. "That's not what family does, Alex. Family supports each other." I didn't respond. Not because he was right, but because I suddenly realized something. This was never about the house. It was about control. Greg had spent years thinking he had authority over this place, over me, and now that illusion had shattered. He wasn't angry because of the rent. He was angry because, for the first time ever, he wasn't the one in charge. And my mother. She wasn't standing in his way because, deep down, she didn't want to lose that stability she had clung to for so long. I took a slow, deep breath. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting. Greg, waiting for me to cave. My mother, hoping I wouldn't push this any further. But I had already come too far to back down now. I met Greg's gaze, steady and unyielding. If family supports each other, I said, voice calm but firm, then why did you think it was okay to charge me rent yesterday? His smirk faltered. I let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, I pushed back from the table and stood up. This isn't about family, Greg, I said. This is about power, and I think we both know you just lost it. His fists clenched. But he didn't have a single thing to say, because for the first time he had nothing left to argue. And that silence? That was the real victory. I turned to my mother, waiting. Waiting for her to say something, anything, to tell Greg he was wrong, to tell me I was right, to stand up for me. But she didn't. She just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, her fingers white from the pressure. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between me and Greg, wide with hesitation, guilt, and something worse, acceptance. And that was when I knew. Greg wasn't the only one who had been using me. My own mother had too. A slow, hollow realization settled in my chest. Greg was just a symptom of a bigger problem. My mother had let this happen. She had let him believe he had control over this house, had allowed him to take charge, make decisions, walk around like he owned the place. And she had done nothing to stop it. Maybe she had even encouraged it in her own way, by staying silent, by looking the other way every time he acted like he was the head of the household. I let out a short, humorless laugh. So you knew? You knew this whole time and you just let him think he was in charge? My mother winced at the sharpness in my voice. Alex, it wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I cut her off. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you were perfectly fine letting him believe whatever he wanted, as long as it made your life easier. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. I was trying to keep the peace, I scoffed. The peace? Whose peace? Because it sure as hell wasn't mine. Greg, still seated, let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, this is priceless, he muttered. The kid thinks he's some kind of victim now. I turned my glare on him. Shut up. His smirk only grew wider. What's wrong, Alex? Thought Mommy was on your side? Hate to break it to you, but she's been letting me run this house for years. You really think that was an accident? I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palms. And that's supposed to mean what, exactly? It means, he said, leaning back in his chair, that maybe, just maybe, your mom never really saw this place as your house. Maybe she saw it as our house. Maybe she figured that, despite whatever some stupid piece of paper says, I was the one actually taking care of things around here. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I refused to let it show. Taking care of things? I echoed. Like what? Sitting on your ass, pretending to be in charge while Mom pays the bills? Greg's jaw twitched, but he didn't lose his composure. Instead, he turned to my mother. Linda, he said, his tone almost gentle, but dripping with manipulation. Tell him you never really saw this place as his. My mother sucked in a breath, but she didn't say a word. I stared at her. Mom? Her gaze dropped to the floor. Alex. We're a family, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed again, but this time, there was no humor in it. Right, family. That's what you're going with? Greg saw his opportunity and took it, his voice turning mockingly sympathetic. See, kid? This is what happens when you start treating your own family like strangers. Talking about rent, contracts, evictions. You think that's what families do to each other? I didn't respond. Be real, Alex, he pressed. You gonna throw your own mother out? You gonna kick her to the curb just to prove some stupid point? My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my voice coming out colder than I'd ever heard it. I wouldn't have to consider any of this if you hadn't tried to pull that bullshit with me first. Greg smirked. So that's a no then. You won't kick her out. He tilted his head slightly. Which means I'm not going anywhere either. His words hit like a punch to the gut. Because deep down I knew he was right. No matter how furious I was, no matter how betrayed I felt, I wasn't heartless. I couldn't throw my mother out of her own home. And Greg knew that. He knew exactly where the line was, and he was using it against me. He leaned forward, voice quiet but victorious. So tell me, Alex, what's your next move? I had no answer, and that was exactly what he wanted. Greg leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at his lips. He thought he had won. My mother still wouldn't meet my eyes, her hands clasped together, shoulders tense. I felt like a stranger in my own home. No, not a stranger, an intruder, because if I let things continue the way they were, that's exactly what I'd become. Greg had made it clear he wasn't leaving, and my mother had made it clear she wasn't going to stop him. If I wanted my house back, I had to force his hand. I took a slow breath and let the frustration drain from my face, replacing it with something else. Calm. Cold. Calculated. Greg noticed. His smirk faltered, just slightly. I leaned forward, fingers tapping lightly on the table, then spoke with deliberate ease. You know what, Greg? You're right. His eyes narrowed. Right about what? About family, about contributing. So let's do this the right way. Let's make it official. Greg frowned. The hell are you talking about? I unlocked my phone, swiped through my documents, then turned the screen toward him. A rental agreement. His smirk vanished. If we're treating this house like a shared space, I continued, then we're going to follow the proper legal process. You and Mom will sign a lease, pay rent like any other tenants, and contribute to household expenses. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Just like you wanted me to. The color drained from Greg's face. You little... I cut him off. Rent will be due at the beginning of each month. If payment isn't made, I have every legal right to evict you. Greg slammed his fist against the table. You think I'm going to sign that bullshit? I shrugged. Then you can pack your things and leave. Silence. My mother gasped. Alex, you don't have to do this. I do, Mom, I said firmly. I should have done it a long time ago. Greg's face was red with fury, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He turned to my mother. Linda, say something. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's best if you go, Greg. His face twisted in disbelief. You're really going to let this little shit kick me out? She looked down. I don't think he's the one who started this. Greg's jaw tightened. His eyes burned with pure hatred, but there was nothing left for him to do. With one last glare, he grabbed his keys off the counter and stormed toward the door. He hesitated, fingers gripping the handle, then turned back. You'll regret this, he spat. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He yanked the door open, stepped outside, and slammed it shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet, peaceful. I let out a slow breath and turned to my mother. She was still sitting at the table, staring at her hands, lost in thought. When she finally lifted her head, there were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't crying. She just looked tired. You've really grown up, she whispered. I met her gaze. I had to. She nodded slowly, as if truly seeing me for the first time. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. This house was mine, and no one would ever take that away from me again.